Okay, so moving right on. Director at Cumulus Studio, our next speaker is Todd Henderson. So Todd has over 15 years of experience in architecture and was named Future Leader in 2012 by the Property Council of Australia. He is passionate about buildability and sustainability, and when I was talking to Chris a little bit earlier, Chris was talking about how amazing Todd is about local stuff as well, really like pushing local communities and local creative people into kind of like doing more and being more, even if it means like kind of crossing over into like a competitor kind of area. So can you please put your hands together and welcome him to the stage?
How you going? I put 15 years, but it's actually 20 because it made me seem younger. So thank you, Marcel, for finishing early. I've got way too many slides for half an hour, so it means you might get lunch. Is it just the triangle at the top? Yeah, okay. So Cumulus Studio. Sorry, I can see it here. So as Matt mentioned, I'm local. I'm the token local today, and we have architecture offices in Launceston, Hobart, and in Victoria. We started, our office started, I was in Launceston, Pete, my business partner, was in Hobart. We both hated our jobs, so we, one night over wine, decided we should quit and start a business together, and the next morning when we'd sobered up, it still seemed like a good idea, so that was kind of how we moved forward. This is a bit about who we are, so who, where, what. That's kind of our current team of people spread across those three offices. And then they're the three directors, so myself, Peter, and then Kylie's kind of the one who brought us together. Kylie and Pete are a couple. Kylie and I did uni together. She kept saying Pete and myself should work together. So we didn't really know each other at the time, but it's all worked quite well, the way we're quite different, which I'll get to. And then Keith came along. He actually applied for a job with us in Melbourne, and he'd worked with Pete previously in Hobart, and he said, I don't really want to be in Launceston, I don't want to be in Tasmania, I prefer to stay in Melbourne, so we thought, well, how about we get him to set up an office for us over there. So basically there's the main three, I guess, design directors. Kylie's the glue that holds all of it together, and we're very different. Pete is very beauty focused, and I'm very sort of function focused, I guess. Which causes lots of arguments in the office, and my wife, who's not a designer, gets worried that we might split the business up because we argue a lot over things, but we like that robust discussion. And this is a diagram someone else had used that we thought really suited us. So you've all been at the barbecue with the beautiful glass Heinz bottle. It looks way better than the other one, but you want to get that last bit of sauce out, so you're banging the bottle. It's just the worst thing to use, whereas the one on the other side is much easier to use. So I'm kind of more that side, and Pete's more the beauty side. And Keith kind of sits in the middle. He's a good moderator between the two. So really, Cumulus is kind of about how do we bring those two things together, being function-centric and sort of beauty-centric. Any Talking Heads fans here? As people walked in, I thought, probably a bit too young to know this, but I thought I'd go back and tell you kind of how I got to where I got to. So these are images of my bedroom when I was probably 15 that I managed to find. So I was always doing stuff, creating stuff, building skate ramps in my backyard, making furniture, and it was always I was always in my dad's shed building. I love that idea of how you put things together. And then pretty much all of that time was spent in spaces like this, which obviously are quite architectural, but I wasn't looking at the buildings, I was actually looking at this. So what could I do with these parts of the building? Because the rest of my time was spent doing this. So it was all about skateboarding, and always being in spaces where we could use it for something more than what it was. I've got some quotes here, which I'm sure people probably won't be able to read, but it's actually been quite widely documented about how skateboarders view architecture and space and the city. And I hadn't really thought about it until I'd become an architect and started reading about it, where the way we think about how spaces are used, and I could pretty much tell you any space in Launceston, I could tell you exactly how the paving sounded underneath the skateboard, or how it sounded if it was just asphalt, or where you'd go if it was raining, what could you use those parts of the building for. So you sort of get a really interesting sense of what buildings were through thinking of them as being something else than what they were designed for. Also, you probably noticed my graphics are nowhere near as good as Marcel's. I'm not really a a digital graphics person. I'm more interested in how I can make things, and I've always, as I said, been making things. So this is start of university. We made a whole bunch of structures. That's us in first year. Then we made some seats, and then the other one, the tower, was a whole bunch of stuff we found out of a skip, and we had 9 hours to make a tower at the architecture school when it used to be back at Newnham. And still now I do lots of, so everything is model making. Rarely ever do I do much computer type work. Obviously we do use CAD to work in the office, but lots of it is more model making, and I find that's a much better way to think about how spaces go together. And we also find it's a much better way to portray things to clients. So we had one client in particular where we did a house. She absolutely hated the CAD renders and said, this is nothing like what I wanted. And then we made a cardboard model of the exact same project. She said, this is the best project ever, I love it. She carried it around in her shoebox everywhere and showed everyone. So it was interesting how she couldn't see the difference between the kind of CAD model and the physical model. And now the house is finished and it sits on the shelf, and it kind of takes pride of place. And my mother was a dressmaker when I was a kid, and so I've now taught my daughter to sew. I used to sew lots. That's actually me. I think going to a 40th, I went as the greatest American hero, as probably most of you don't know what that is, but lots of sewing, making, doing things with my hands. So I guess today I want to talk a bit about projects, but more about that process of how we do the architectural projects. You guys have never seen this diagram before. As Marcel was talking, I was like, yes, positive kind of reinforcement. But it's interesting, we spoke previously at another talk and someone showed this diagram and said, I made up this diagram, it's blah blah blah, and we had it in our diagrams next, so it was quite awkward because we couldn't actually remember where we got it from, and maybe they did make it up. But we do, I guess, think about this, and I totally agree with what Marcel said about how you go through those different stages, but this is really what we talk to our clients about. So lots of inputs, because clients expect to have one meeting and then we turn up and say, here's your beautifully designed building. So we talk about it's lots of baby steps, lots of going through stages, and then at the end we have an evaluation loop. So every project we go back and we ask the client, how did we go? We ask the builder, how did we go? So all those things we can do to kind of develop our business to be something better. So again, this is a project, a recent project with a client. The other thing we like to do is bring the clients in. So if it's a house we're doing, which this one is a house, how do we make them part of that design? So it's their house, we're just sort of a mechanism for them to get where they need to get to. So this was in their farmhouse, we're doing a new building for them, and basically we took the foam cutter down and we cut a whole bunch of shapes and we talked about it. We went up on site and stood in different places and said, where can we get the best views, etc. So it's kind of about bringing them in as part of that design stage. This one, again, we really believe everything's a remix. We don't think we're inventing anything, so we're taking things, how do we transform them into something else? This is a pretty common used diagram, but pretty much everything we do, we understand this is how it works. And then we really think that there should be lots of options. So lots of the work we do is options, options, and then how we evaluate those options. So this was an extension to a house, and we made a whole bunch of little form models that we could then work out, how does the sun get in, how does this attach to the house, how does it work with planning requirements, etc. And this diagram, I think, is a really good one because it shows how many possibilities there are. So I'm not sure if anyone can read that, but the first one's a 2 8-stud brick. You can combine that 24 ways. Next one's 3 8-studs, that's 1,060 ways. 6 8-stud bricks is 915,103,765 ways. And if you've got 8 bricks, you can actually, it's virtually endless how many ways you can put it together. So I quite often talk to architecture students about this, how they say, oh, look, I've got 2 options, but there's so many options and you've got to be quick. How do you quickly do options and show people different ways you could think about it? And that's how we work in the office. And that kind of then, we're quite rigorous then about how we look at those options. So we might kind of pare it down to a couple of options. This is a project recently where we had 3 different schemes, and so we can actually look at, okay, these are the different options, and then we can weigh them up against design criteria. So this might be what the client's brief was, and we can actually do a really good way of evaluating it to work out which one's the best one that we should be doing, as opposed to just picking the one that we think looks best. So it's quite a rigorous way we work through those. So generally there's a design criteria, then there might be some guiding principles, or you can see contextual issues we had on this one. This was the first diagram we drew when we started. We had a really great lecturer way back when I was at first year uni, and he said the more ideas you put up in in the cloud, the more will rain down on you. So we've always believed that the more people we can work with and get as part of the process, the better the projects will be. So this was, I guess, Pete and I at the start, and then we would sort of talk together and bring as many people in as possible to get the bigger idea. Cumulus actually means, is Latin for heap, and that's where the name for the cumulus cloud comes from. So more ideas, the bigger and better the ideas are. So now I thought I'd talk about some projects we've done, and I guess I picked projects that are really linked between the branding. So we had people that had a strong brand, or then we brought in someone to do the branding, and then the architecture and how the two could actually complement each other. But before I get to those, this is the first ever project we did. We'd started Cumulus, we had no clients, so we thought, how can we get people to be interested in what we're doing? So we went out to the architecture school, got on the laser cutter, and we cut out a whole bunch of these plywood reindeers, and we just sent them to everyone we knew, wherever, that we knew had been a developer, hotelier, who knows what, and it had a little thing saying Merry Christmas from Cumulus, and every year we've done new ones. So the picture here, Chloe's now, I don't know, she must be probably 18 or 17, 18. So she put together that first one, and we've now done about 4 projects for her family. And these are the reindeers. Every year they say, when are our reindeers coming? They love getting these kind of new reindeers, so every year we have to do new ones. But the first project, probably the first significant project we did, was the Apple Shed, which is in Hobart, the home of Willie Smiths. They came to us and said we want to do a cellar door for our kind of growing cider business. And we looked around. They were obviously down the Huon Valley, and they had an existing orchard, so you can see the Smiths orchard there, and then there was an existing apple shed down the road, which was a museum, and the museum wasn't doing very well because it's sort of full of a whole bunch of stuff. So we convinced them that they should approach the guy that owned it and buy it off him and try and turn that into the home of Willie Smiths as opposed to building a new building. So obviously they had the product. So you can see the guy tossing the apple, that's Andrew, that's his father. They're third and fourth generation apple farmers from the Huon Valley. And so obviously the spiritual home kind of brought all these things together. And they also had really beautiful branding. So the Willie Smiths brand, I think they understood that to have a great product, they had to put that brand out there and make it something bigger than it was when they first started. And when we talked to them, we said, what do you have? They had no money. They couldn't afford to pay us, so we got paid in cider. Pete loves cider, I don't, but we have cases and cases of it. So we said, what do you have lots of? And they said, we've got lots of apples. They had lots of apple bins, so crates, apple bins everywhere, lots of pallets, lots of boxes that said Willie Smith on them, and obviously apples, as I said, and lots of recycled timber. And then they'd bought this space, so this was an existing apple shed down the road. And inside was just full of stuff, so much stuff. It had every single bit of history of the Huon Valley and things about apples and whatever, and you couldn't walk through the space. So we kind of collected up the things that were important and tried to how do we put all that together and create a project? So the strategy was, this is sort of a plan. You'd enter in and walk around this kind of crazy maze of stuff. It had mouldy apples on the wall that no one had moved for years and all sorts of things. And we kind of cleared it all up and said, okay, let's have a really clear entry. You come in and have a series of really well curated parts about the Huon Valley and apples. So you can see there we had an empty shed. The biggest amount of money, I think, was about 30 grand they spent to sandblast the interior because it had this horrible green colour. And then all of a sudden people from the community said, oh, I can come and help. I've got a drill, I've got a saw. And so the whole thing was put together by people that just lived in the community. It's almost become the community centre for the Huon Valley. So we added this addition in the middle and then subtracted parts out of it, and the addition's got a kitchen in it and a bar. And this is what it looks like now. So it had the green colour, and we kind of cleared out as much as we could but kept as much of the heritage that was there. And inside we reconfigured the entry, so now you come in, as I said, it's quite curated in terms of all the photos of who started the apple growing industry. At the end there's a big still that you can see where they make some of the cider. And then the apple boxes we used, so again what they had, free boxes, so we put a whole bunch of boxes on this element that sits in the middle that really sets up the space. And then you look through all of these little elements. We actually worked with Fatago in Hobart, so they helped us to kind of clear out as much stuff, bring back as much stuff as we needed, did a full inventory of what was there and made it much clearer to understand the apple story. So you can see here, this is sort of about the Smith family, and then there's a whole bunch of stuff about other orchardists down there. And use the apple crate, etc. You can open up all these boxes and have a look through. So it was a really good one where we worked with a branding and graphics business to actually bring the two together. So it has a really kind of cohesive feeling. And then that's this is actually the day it opened, where there was only 2 types of apples, but now that wall has, each one of those is a different type of apple with a label under it, and they've actually got the whole wall filled up. I think it's one of the most Instagram things down there, so people love looking at it. So again, this idea, we had Willie Smith's brand, Fatago did the storytelling, we had words by Bill Seeger and Chris Viney. The builders, as I said, were just local builders and people putting stuff together. And then you can see Liz, who works for us, and her partner, who's not an architect, standing on the ladder putting together boxes for us on the night it was opening. So we all got involved to try and get this thing open. The next one is in Hobart. This is Lady Gowrie. So they approached us. They're a child and family centre, and they needed a new home in Hobart, so South Hobart. The building was an old mechanic shed, which takes up that site, so it's between Macquarie Street and Davey Street. And it looked like this when we first went on site, and looked like this inside, obviously, so lots of different levels and complicated building. That's us sort of wandering around on site the first day. And then what we did is we kind of worked out what are all the parts of this building that we can bring together. So there are all the different parts, obviously childcare, they do family support, they want to be part of the community, have an existing warehouse, which was a great space, sort of similar to this, how you can fit things in, and then they do staff training as well. So the kind of approach on this was pull off the front bit of architecture that was probably the worst bit of building stock. So we got rid of that. So we had a nice blank site. Then we added a new element to it, and it's kind of got a building block aesthetic to it where we can actually add some bits and subtract them. So we subtracted bits out to get sun in, create some outdoor spaces for the inhabitants, the kids to play in. So obviously it's quite urban, there's not really any outdoor space. Then we put a new entry into this building, and really the most complicated bit was all the ramps. So, the levels. So we got stairs, through nearly everything was like a half level. So it actually created a really great architectural space because you could see into a series of different spaces, but it became quite complicated in terms of how you move between those spaces. So this is what it was like. This is now what it's like. And again, we worked with Fatago, and they came in and this beautiful branding exercise about how do we bring people through and tie the entire project together. So this is a beautiful gate at the front they made, quite playful, turns into a bit of sign writing on the ground that runs right down to the main street. It's someone in our office's child, I think. And then we worked with Jude Abel in Hobart, she actually did her architecture degree at the same time Pete and I were doing it, and now she does lots of art installations and works on public art projects. So she worked with us in the front entry. We laid a whole bunch of block work. How could we do something simple with block work, and laid that through the front entry. And then it got mirrors applied to it. So it's got this beautiful, playful entry. You can see the handrail, the front fence becomes a handrail that actually draws people into the building. And then that runs right through. So the whole building has this kind of branding that runs through with a yellow handrail that becomes part of the whole space. And that's the interior space. So again, we had no outdoor space, so we ended up with a huge warehouse, double height space. We chopped out a floor, put a laser light roof on so that you could actually get light into this space and make it feel outdoors, but it's actually an indoor space. So that's the outdoor space at the front. You can see up to Mount Wellington, see through the screen. So obviously all the children there are quite safe. They can't fall out of this space, but they can see down to the road and see the city beyond. So the next one is, I'm sure everyone's seen this, but Devil's Corner. Again, they had a really great brand and a great product, but they had a terrible cellar door just because that was sort of all they had at the time. The branding, obviously, you can see on there is beautifully done. They just wrapped this building and they came to us and said, how can we make it something better than what it is? Their original brief to us, we want a viewing deck so people stop. So I'm talking like a deck I'm standing on so you can look across to the hazards. Again, we said, what do you have? And they said lots of containers. Obviously, they had a beautiful view. And so all these things went in to kind of start this project. And it was really 4 simple ideas. The first one was a stop sign. How do you get people to stop and come into the winery? So that was what we did. We got a whole bunch of containers and stacked them up. And as you come down the highway, you see this building. Everyone goes, oh, I need to stop there and have a look. The tourism tracker said it's the most visited toilet in Tasmania, which I'm very proud of. So everyone goes there to go to the bathroom and buy a glass of wine. So that's obviously what you see. This is just from a car, the highway view you see of it. And then the back of the building as you approach it. So the other part of it had to be movable. So I gave this talk in Brisbane. It was quite funny because I said, we couldn't get a builder to build it because it's 2 hours from anywhere. And they thought it was quite funny because obviously over there everyone drives 2 hours anywhere. But we couldn't get a builder from Hobart and we couldn't get a builder from Launceston. They just couldn't believe they have to drive that far to build the thing. So we actually made it a demountable building. It was portable and taken to site and lifted on site by the builders. So it went up quite quickly. So they put all the containers together, lifted it up into place, and then clad it with the timber cladding. The third part of it was this idea about how all wines are different. So how do you bring the different wine experiences and tasting wine and drinking wine into the building? So we looked at that in the sense of how do we create these different views of the building. So the first view you have is that hazards view is almost blocked. So you get to the building and you can't actually see the hazards. Then the next one was about this kind of cranked container, which was all about a sky view. So what we found was a lot of the international tourists that came to Tasmania couldn't believe how beautifully blue our sky was. So as you walk into this space, it takes away, obviously it's an overcast day, but it takes away everything else and you just see that blue sky or the beautiful white clouds. And we have lots of people that try and run up the ramp and get out the end, as you can see. The other one was about the horizon view. So then as you move from space to space, you end up with this horizon view looking out over the hazards. And again, it's quite a different space to the previous one you're in. And then the tower has a series of, views out of it where you're looking northeast, southwest. So again, looking at different parts of the winery and the surroundings. The cage was put on. One of the things I should probably mention is architecture is really complicated and really litigious. So we have lots of building surveyors, lots of people telling us what we can and can't do. They told us we needed to put this metal screen because people might try and jump out of the thing. It's now gone. We managed to win that battle, but that had to go in at the start of the project. But I think it's an interesting one how a lot of what we do is design, but a lot of it is how do we solve all those difficult things. Probably the most difficult one's gravity, so obviously we need to make buildings that stand up. But standards, building codes are a really complicated part of what we do. So that's the view from the top, which now the mesh screen's gone. And the fourth idea was this idea of the client didn't want to build a cellar door. They said, look, we're great at making wine. We're not great at employing a whole bunch of staff. We don't want to have a kitchen. So we came up with this idea of how do we, set it up as almost a mini village that could grow. And then you let other people come and run things there. So they put in 2 commercial spaces, went out and said who'd be interested. There was a seafood place and a pizza. Tom Bolo said, yeah, we'll have one. So these guys come, they just cook pizzas, they just make fish and chips. Devil's Corner make the wine, and the whole thing works quite well. And Devil's Corner don't then have to worry about, where do we get staff, how do we do this, how do we do that? So now we're actually doing another development here, big master plan. They've got a whole bunch more food that want to come there, food vendors, etc., and making it kind of a bigger thing. But again, it's still this small village in terms of lots of different buildings that can come and go. This one's a really small project we did for TasPorts at Birrelli. So Birrelli gets lots of cruise ships, as you probably don't realise. And Birrelli's a really, really kind of grungy port. And they said, we get all these international tourists. They might have just come from somewhere else and they get here and they're at our port. So how do we make an experience for them and give them somewhere to stand? They used to actually have, people would get off the cruise ships and they'd have like just a marquee from Bunnings that people would stand underneath. And so again, we thought, how can we make something that could be used and reused? This is obviously the port, you can see there. This is what it looks like. So it's a proper working port. There's lots of ships coming and going, lots of goods coming and going. Lots of really big stuff, which we quite liked how big all of the things on site were. This is what the cruise ships are like when they come in. That's the wood chip pile, and people land right next to the wood chip pile and get off. So it's quite interesting. These people may have been on a cruise somewhere beautiful in somewhere in Europe, and then they're all of a sudden here. And again, this idea of big. So this is Phil and I in the office. We both of us read this book to our children, and this kind of idea of these huge big ships, and we like this idea that the ships come in and they're almost like huge buildings that come into port, and we're going to be this tiny thing down the bottom. So the idea was people get off the boat, they then go into something they can stand in if it's rainy, windy, etc. Then they get on a bus and then they go to Cradle Mountain. So they're kind of in this thing for only a small amount of time while they wait for the buses. So how do we make it something interesting as people get to the boat, get to port, and they're looking down onto this thing, make it something that's part of their experience before they go through it? And it had to be, again, transportable, so we were given quite clear we can only use containers, which we'd done before many times. And the interesting thing is they set up these cruise port shelters within 40 minutes, and they take them down within about 10 minutes of people getting off the boat, because that cruise ship goes and then the next one's coming in, which might be a container ship or a wood chip ship or something like that. So they had to be really quite flexible the way they moved around. So they had to have 2 containers to fit the people in. As I said, you got 40 minutes, so you put 2 containers down. Then we had to put some sort of joining thing between the containers, so almost an umbrella. And so then we thought, how can we make that something really interesting? So that becomes a branding exercise on the side of it. Again, we work with Fatago, and it was all about welcome to Tasmania. How do we make people feel welcome in Tasmania as they get off? So we had these huge hoods made that, again, had to be lifted on by a forklift, so everything was quite strict in how they went together. So one person can put the containers down, put the lid over the top, and bring the blinds down. This is just a plan if anyone's interested, but they're really quite small. They've got a couple of seats inside, they've got a perching bench and a couple of windows. So you can see down in the bottom section, there's sort of a spot where people can sit on their mobile phone, because we find people don't tend to sit on seats anymore. They like to lean on the edge of something. And then the next part of it was about material and experience. So we didn't kind of shy away from the fact that there is a huge wood chip pile next to you. And we made that part of the experience as people come in. So all the interiors are OSB, which is a pretty commonly used, cheap, robust product. We then had portholes in it to get these views of the huge bits of... we had, I guess, as I said, lots of big bits of machinery around that was really interesting. So how do we then pick views where you only see those bits of equipment? And we came up with this idea of a whole series of quite sculptural windows on the outside of the building that then picked up the views around the ports. So that's what it's like as you walk through. The OSB's folded in. It's quite interesting when you're in the space, because it feels like the walls are quite thick, but they're actually quite thin, and it's just the little portholes on the outside that give it that feeling. At the last minute, Burnie City Council came in and said, seeing as we're putting money in, we want to put heaps of our branding all over these things. And they got pretty terrible branding. I hope no one did it here. So I guess that presented a bit of a challenge, and what we did is all the glass we used in the buildings, we said, we're going to use all your colours and we're going to put it on the glass. So it actually became quite makes the space quite beautiful, but it was a good way to not cover it in branding as you're walking through there. So when you get to the port from the ship, that's what you see. So we've got these welcome to wildlife. There's a whole bunch of different branding exercises on the side, but Tasmanian devils, platypuses, etc. Because you are quite high, they're sort of 6 to 10 stories above the ground, above the water when you get off, and people walk down and walk through these structures. We kind of think of them as they're like witches' hats, where we just kind of guide people through to something, but they stand in them, there's brochures, etc., and they get on the bus. This is a competition that we unfortunately lost, which probably should mention, in your lifetime you would enter a lot of competitions or submit for a lot of things, and you'll probably get hardly any of them. That tends to be most people's experience of anything in design, but I think for us it's a really good way. We like doing competitions because it's a good way to actually think about how you design and what you want to be about as you design, and really evaluate how you go about things. So this was Puffing Billy, which is a famous train ride you can go to. We did a building that was all about kind of exhibition and movement, how we could tie it to the tie it into what Puffing Billy was. So I'll just go back. So we basically had a linear building that you would walk through. We grabbed both ends and turned it into a circular building that you could move through. Then we widened that kind of donut for the program, so which bits needed more space for kitchens, etc., and which bits could be thinner. And then we had individual spaces on that. So when you're in the building, you see Puffing Billy go past. The whole thing was about how do you get this beautiful view of the train. And this is sort of movement through the site. So we had a whole bunch of ways pedestrians moved through, vehicles to deal with, service vehicles that we didn't want to see. And then the whole building had a big courtyard space in the middle. This is sort of cruising along into the building along a kind of covered way. And then this experience of entry. So we took cues from trains and train tunnels and kind of opened up a whole series of arches into this courtyard space. And then the whole building had a sort of sense like the train going across the bridge. And inside it all looks into this central courtyard and then the train beyond, but all the spaces are interconnected so you can view through them. This one's probably a bit more detailed, but it shows that kind of widening of the program so you can see kitchens and how all those spaces work. We had retail spaces, etc., and then where the train runs past. And that's the view inside that courtyard space. Interestingly, the architects who won just did a roof. Just a shed and a roof and nothing else. So this is probably a bit more flexible than ours, and maybe that's why they won the competition. It's quite beautiful. Ticketing, retail. And then we really looked at the site and took cues from the colours, etc., how we could take that and bring it into the building and a landscape approach. Anyone in Launceston's probably been to Kosaten, Japanese restaurant. We've done one in Hobart, one in Launceston. And it was a little old Makita repair shop that our client bought, the client owns all the bentos, and we've done plenty of those over the years, and he came to us with a new idea. So this is the Makita shop on the corner. This is what it looked like inside. It was amazing. The guy had been there, I think, for 30 years. He's got some pretty unsavoury calendars down the back wall that you probably can't see. And it was full of 30 years of drills and saws and stuff. And I just couldn't believe, he said, oh no, I'll never move any of the stuff out. He just piled it up out the back. And they actually brought in a big backhoe and took all of it out of there. But what we had to work with here was quite a beautiful blank canvas. We've got a very stylish Japanese client who always dresses very well. So that's him on site with us, wandering around, working out what we can do. And the strategy for this one was, it's kind of like a high-speed sushi train, but it was interesting because he said, I've already bought the train and I've already bought all the bits, so we had to work out how we're going to fit it in the space. He didn't kind of work out the space and then work out the bits. So it was quite a bit like a Meccano set, and we had to organise the spaces around it. So obviously it had a whole series of bits. We had transport food, so the food comes out quite quickly. It had to come from a central kitchen space. And in order to make it feel quite intimate, we broke it up into little districts and based it on, obviously, Japan. So those districts run along. We've got sort of a step down at the back of the building we had to deal with, and you can see through series of spaces. So it's really quite a nice way to think about the building in terms of how you can see into different spaces of it. So the first district was all about cherry blossoms. It feels quite fresh and spring-like. And then the next one was sort of a Shibuya Street signs and lights. When you're in that space, it feels quite different as well. It's all one big linear space that you walk through. Then the third space was a tatami room. So this is a room where you might do private dining. The moon gate we obviously couldn't do, so there's a digital moon gate kind of on the wall there that looks like the trees are all moving. It's quite beautiful. Then there's a private room at the end which can be closed off obviously and can be serviced from the sushi train. That's the private room. And then up the back there's kind of this Kyoto lantern traditional type space which feels quite feels quite grungy and rustic, and there's a whole bunch of different branding and graphic exercises. I can't remember the artist. I think it might have been Daisy Legs did that for us. So this space is again this sort of intimate space, but you can look down into the other spaces from there. That's my family who get to model in lots of photos. And that's how it looks from the outside. So we really did nothing to the outside of the building. How do we make it as kind of not look like anything's happened to the building, we just put a new sign on the front. And a few people have said, oh, where is this place, when they see the internal shots. And then the front of it, still kept the bars on the windows, just put a new front door. And that is that.